Silence clung to the abandoned train depot like dust, thick, unmoving, and old enough to taste. The first breath inside the place felt borrowed, as though the air still belonged to the ghosts that once drifted through its cracked beams and hollow corridors. In the weak spill of dawn, everything seemed ghostlit. The warped floorboards slick with decades of neglect, the skeletal benches leaning into each other like mourners, the shadows stirring in corners that should have been empty. The light came in fractured slants, slicing across the dust motes that hovered above the tracks, broken ribbons of illumination, more memory than presence. It was the kind of place where sound refused to be born. Even footsteps felt swallowed before they landed. And here, where the past had not only settled but calcified, I first felt her name take shape against the cold. Her name, Crane, aged 21 the year she disappeared, seemed to curl into the rafters like smoke, as if the building itself exhaled it back to me. I whispered it aloud, not for evidence, not for protocol, but because silence needs a counterweight. A name soft enough to bruise. A name that still clung to me, even though I'd never admitted why. The depot had been closed since 1981, 2 years after she vanished. By then, the paint had already begun peeling in long strips like shedding skin, and the soot-stained windows no longer pretended to let light in. Locals said the train stopped running because federal funding dried up, but that was only half believed. The rest of the whispers credited something darker, something that seeped into the foundation around the time the girl with auburn hair and a laugh like wind chimes walked out of her shift at the diner and never made it home. I moved slowly through the station, the boards creaking beneath my boots like tired breaths. My flashlight beam jittered across faded posters, a county fair from the summer of '78, a missing dog notice curled inward like a dying leaf, an old election flyer for a mayor no one remembered. Time had stopped here, yes, but not cleanly. It had twisted, folded over itself, left fingerprints of guilt in places no one ever bothered to search. And in the quiet, oh, the quiet, I felt the past press its cold palms against my ribs, not with violence, with recognition. I knew this place too well. Not because of the case file that lived in the archives, not because of the grainy black and white photo clipped to the corner, showing Crane smiling on the front steps of her mother's porch, unaware that cameras sometimes serve as a final portrait. No, my connection to this station lived elsewhere, buried in the parts of myself I spent years refusing to excavate, parts I'd promised never to touch again. But some places call you back in ways you cannot refuse. A breeze sifted through the broken window panes, stirring the papers scattered across the floor. They rustled like a quiet warning, like someone shifting in sleep. It brought with it the faint scent of damp earth and something older, old sorrow perhaps, or the residue of promises never kept. In the far corner, beneath the splintered ticket booth, I saw it again, the unmistakable shape of absence, the void where something once belonged, a hollow big enough to hold a truth I was not yet ready to revisit. I whispered again, though I didn't know why. Maybe her name steadied me. Maybe it haunted me. Or maybe the boundary between those two things had long since dissolved. Outside, the Alabama morning thickened, humid and heavy. The horizon held the faint orange bruise of sunrise. And still, the depot refused to warm. A coldness lived here, quiet but sharp, like the underside of memory. I stood in the center of the station, letting the silence press against my ears until I could hear my own pulse. Slow, steady, liar, because beneath it something else thudded, a rhythm I recognized too well, the echo of a past mistake masquerading as duty. This was where her story ended. This was where mine began to unravel. And the truth, whatever shape it took, waited somewhere in this rotting skeleton of a place, waiting for me to admit why I had returned. The object lay half buried beneath a layer of brittle leaves and grime, positioned neatly where sunlight managed only the faintest intrusion. At first glance, it looked like the cast-off debris of decades, just another forgotten scrap in a place full of them. But objects that persist through time always have a reason. Evidence is never patient without purpose. I crouched, brushing away the dirt with slow, deliberate strokes. My breath caught, not dramatically, not like the movies, but in a small, traitorous hitch that betrayed recognition before my mind had time to catch up. It was a silver locket, tarnished to a dull gray, its chain tangled like a confession. The delicate floral etching on the front, the tiny lilies curling around a central stem, was unmistakably hers. I knew this because the case file had included a photo, wearing it the summer her boyfriend left town. Her sister said she never took it off, that it was her favorite thing she owned, that it was missing the day she disappeared. And now here it lay, as if it had been waiting for me specifically, preserved by abandonment. My gloved fingers lifted it from the floor. The metal was cold, unnaturally so, as though it had been steeped in winter. A long silence filled the depot, the kind that grows when the past insists on returning. "Not possible," I murmured, but the depot swallowed the words greedily. The locket felt too intimate in my palm, too knowing. Symbolic objects have weight, metaphorical and otherwise. They are memory condensed into matter. They don't lie. They don't exaggerate. They simply wait to be found by the wrong or right person. And I knew exactly why this discovery unsettled me more than anything I'd found in my career. Because I should have found it years ago. Back when the case first crossed my desk. Back when I'd stood in this exact depot, promising myself I was analyzing the scene with objectivity, ignoring the knot in my gut, ignoring the echo of familiarity that threaded through the rafters, ignoring the fact that her smile from the case file clung to me long after I left the building. Yet the locket hadn't been here then, I was sure. I replayed my memory of that day, but the image wavered, the lighting wrong, the dust thicker or thinner than I recalled. Memory has a way of distorting itself around guilt. It reshapes, rearranges, camouflages. I turned the locket over in my palm. The hinges were stiff. I pressed a thumbnail into the seam and heard a faint click. Inside, beneath the delicate glass, was a single faded photograph. Standing in the doorway of the diner where she worked, apron crooked, hair swept over one shoulder. But the detail that froze me was not her face. It was mine. Blurred in the background, unmistakable. The photograph should not exist. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, not physically, but somewhere deeper, in the quiet, unexamined parts of my mind. My hands remained steady, trained by years of handling evidence, but inside something fractured. Had I been there that day? I tried to recall the timeline, tried to remember if I ever stopped by that diner before she vanished, tried to summon something concrete. Instead, I found fog, a fog that felt deliberate, a fog that felt placed there by someone, likely myself. The silence of the depot thickened, settling into the hollow spaces between the rafters and my ribs. The locket hung from my fingers, swinging gently, like a pendulum measuring not time but truth. A cold realization crept in, quiet but merciless. This case wasn't resurfacing because of new evidence. It was resurfacing because I had run out of places to hide. Obsession doesn't announce itself. It arrives disguised as dedication, extra hours, revisited notes, a sense of responsibility that feels noble until it consumes you from the inside. When I first took the Crane case, I told myself it was duty, a lingering injustice, a file left to rot like the depot it centered around. But somewhere in the spaces between protocol and memory, something shifted. Holding the locket now, I felt the truth coil closer. I wasn't just tied to this case. I was woven into it. But obsession prefers half-truths. It prefers shadows that resemble clarity. It thrives in the gap between what you know and what you fear you've forgotten. I sat on the old bench near the center of the depot, a bench that groaned beneath my weight, as if waking from a long sleep. I rested my elbows on my knees and let the locket hang from my hand. The metal glinted in a thin ray of sunlight, casting a faint shimmer across the dust, a shimmer that pulsed like a heartbeat. What unsettled me most wasn't that the locket had appeared. It was that a piece of my memory was missing. A singular, precise cut, as though someone had excised a moment from my life and stitched the edges together without bothering to hide the seam. I tried to recall that day outside the diner, tried to remember if I ever interacted with before her disappearance. But the harder I reached, the further the memory receded, folding back into itself like a frightened animal. I rubbed my temple. My pulse drummed beneath my skin, steady, yes, but too loud. The depot's silence amplified it, turning each beat into a soft accusation. Why her? Why now? Why me? 3 questions I'd avoided for decades. Outside, a cicada droned its lonely song, a sound both grating and mournful. It echoed through the open doorway, vibrating through the empty space. Even nature sounded like a warning here. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from the precinct asking for an update. I stared at the screen without answering. Words felt useless when the story unfolding inside my mind refused to stay linear. I slipped the locket into an evidence bag, sealing it with trembling fingers, not from fear of the object, from fear of myself. Because I had spent years telling myself I was objective, detached, a professional. But professionals don't dream of victims. They don't wake to echoes of laughter they never consciously heard. They don't feel haunted by faces that should be no more than ink on paper. Crane had lived inside my thoughts for years, not as a puzzle to solve, but as an unanswered confession. A delicate ghost pressing her presence against the inside of my skull. I rose from the bench, letting my hand glide along the rough wooden back. The splinters caught at my skin, small and sharp, tiny reminders that the world doesn't soften just because memory does. The depot shifted around me. The beams creaked. The dust swirled. The sunlight dimmed as clouds dragged themselves across the sky. And I realized with a slow, suffocating certainty, I hadn't come here to reopen the case. I'd come because some part of me already knew the truth. Because some part of me remembered something my waking mind refused to acknowledge. Duty had brought me here. Obsession would keep me. And whatever lay ahead, whatever truth waited in the shadows of this decayed place, wasn't evidence. It was me. The past never returns alone. It comes trailing people behind it, faces etched with time, eyes sharpened by grief, voices carrying the strain of words reheated and retold. When the Crane case was reopened, it wasn't the paperwork that made the air heavier at the station. It was the names. The first was Crane's mother. She arrived at the precinct door as if she'd been there all along, just outside the frame, waiting for someone to widen it. Age had carved new lines into her face, but her posture held something stubborn, like a doorway that refuses to sag no matter how the house around it decays. She clutched her handbag against her ribs as though it were an anchor, or armor. When she saw me, her eyes tightened, not in recognition but in something adjacent. A sense that I was familiar in the way long-haul storms can be, You know the pattern, not the source. You're the one handling's case, she asked, voice low, as though even the walls might misuse her daughter's name. Yes, ma'am, I said. I was assigned. You were there before, she interrupted, gaze narrowing. Years ago, you came to the house, asked questions. A faint static filled my head. I remembered driving past the Crane house. I remembered watching the porch light flicker through my windshield, undecided between on and off. But stepping inside, sitting with her mother, the memory was unclear, fogged like glass breathed upon. If I did, I said carefully, it would have been as part of the initial investigation. I've reviewed the files. There were multiple agents, local and federal. No, she said, with a certainty that scraped against something inside me. There was you. I remember your eyes. I remember you said you'd bring her home. The silence that followed was thin, fragile. I felt it press against my eardrums. I gestured to the chairs across from my desk. Please, Mrs. Crane, sit. This time we're closer. We found something. Her gaze sharpened. Her. Something that belonged to her, I said, at the old depot. Her hands trembled just enough for the leather of her handbag to creak. I told them, she whispered. I told them that place wasn't finished with us. Nobody listened. They said I was imagining. Her eyes lifted to mine, wet but steady. You're not imagining, I said. I wished I believed that for both of us. The second person was Anna's younger sister. She'd been a teenager when vanished. Now she carried the tired composure of someone who'd outlived too many versions of the same story. She met me behind the diner where I used to work, where the kitchen heat still flowed out the back door in slow, greasy waves. Cigarette smoke curled from between Anna's fingers, though most of it seemed to burn unattended. You're late, she said without accusation, just fact. Got held up at the station. She nodded once, looking past me to the parking lot where a few pickups sat under the dim sag of the security light. Mom told me, she said, about the locket. I hesitated. Word travels fast. It's a small town, she replied. We don't have much else to talk about besides what never got finished. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The night felt thinner here, the air edged with fryer oil, asphalt, and unshed rain. Did you remember it? I asked. The locket. She exhaled slowly, smoke drifting like a half-formed thought. It was hers, Anna said. I saved up for months to buy it. She used to joke that it made her look like someone who could leave this place someday. College, city lights, something bigger than Alabama and the 3 blocks that know your name. And the lilies. A faint smile flickered across her face, more wound than warmth. She liked lilies, said they looked like flowers growing out of grief. The phrase lodged itself in my brain, unsettlingly familiar. I wasn't sure if I'd heard it before or simply wanted to. How much do you remember about that summer? I asked. Her gaze slid to mine, sharp now. Why, you think I'm hiding something? I think you've lived with this longer than anyone, I said. Memory warps. It erases what hurts. It adds what makes sense. But sometimes it leaves fingerprints. I just want to know what's left. She was quiet for a moment, the cigarette burning low between her fingers. I remember her laughing, Anna said slowly. I remember the last time she left for work. It was hot. She tied her hair up and said if she had to pour one more cup of coffee for men who called her like it was a leash, she'd drive a train right through this town. Her voice tightened. I remember there was someone watching from across the street. Not close, just there, leaning against a car. My pulse ticked louder. Did you see his face? I asked. No, she said. Or maybe I did and I've forgotten it so I can keep moving. But I remember one thing. What? He never came forward, not when they searched, not when they interviewed everyone, not when they asked me about anyone who might have followed her. Maybe he didn't matter, maybe he did. But if someone stands and watches you like that, they're part of the story, even if they never speak a word. I swallowed. The depot's silence seemed to stretch across town, threading from its cracked windows to this dim-lit alley. "Do you remember his car?" I asked. She hesitated, eyes unfocusing as she reached into the long hallway of her memory. "Dark," she said, "older, nothing shiny. The kind of car that disappears once it turns the corner, like it never existed." Something cold slid down my spine. Once upon a time, I'd driven a car like that. The third person was a ghost who still breathed. Sheriff Dalton, retired now, living on the edges of town like a secret everyone pretends they've forgotten. He handled the original search in '79, long before federal files, long before my name ever appeared on a single page. His house sat back from the road, half swallowed by tall grass and rusted memories. Wind chimes hung near the front door, but they didn't sing. The metal had fused together, stilled by neglect. He opened the door before I knocked twice. "You're back," he said, as if I'd visited recently. "We've reopened the Crane case," I told him. "I thought you might have insight that wasn't recorded." He smirked, a tired twist of the mouth. "You think everything worth knowing makes it onto paper?" "That's what I'm asking." His gaze slid over my shoulder, scanning the empty road. Then he stepped aside. "Come in, Agent." Inside, the house smelled faintly of bourbon, dust, and something antiseptic. Photographs lined the hallway, faces, badges, parades of long-ago small-town pride. "I remember you," Dalton said, walking ahead of me toward the kitchen. "You came down here in the early '90s, said you were reviewing cold cases, sat right where you're standing, asked me why our files were so thin." The word stung. "I don't recall that," I admitted. He gave a humorless chuckle. "Most people don't recall the times they were least useful." We sat across from each other at the wooden table. Dalton poured coffee into chipped mugs, the liquid dark enough to resemble something else entirely. "Tell me, Agent," he said, "why, after all this time, after all the stories that never got an ending?" My throat felt dry. Evidence surfaced at the depot. "Depot," he echoed, watching me. "You and that depot. When you came before, you wouldn't shut up about it. Swore something was wrong with that place. Walked the tracks like you were retracing steps you couldn't admit were your own." His words landed like stones, dropped into still water. "I did that?" I asked, voice quieter than I intended. Dalton's eyes thinned. "You sure you don't remember?" I didn't answer, couldn't. "Some cases don't just get assigned to you," he said. "You bring them with you even when you pretend you don't. Crane Girl's one of those, I figure, not just for the town." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Be careful, Agent. Sometimes when you dig too deep into someone else's disappearance, you find parts of yourself you buried for a reason." The wind chimes outside shuddered once, as if something had brushed past them. 3 people, 3 perspectives, 3 mirrors angled toward the same void. With her steadfast grief. Anna with her half-remembered watcher. Dalton with his unspoken accusation. Each tied unwillingly or not to me. And through their stories, I felt the ground shift under the case, the facts loosening, the timeline bending. It wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. It was about the man who kept returning to the scene, pretending he'd arrived for the first time. Me. The locket was only the first object. Cases like this never reopen for a single reason. They unfold like a sequence of unfinished thoughts, each new detail less a revelation than a reminder. A sense that the truth had always been present, hiding in the spaces we chose not to examine. The next clue came from paper, thin, fragile, stubborn. We found the box in the attic of the Crane house. Had never touched it in decades. It sat tucked behind old Christmas decorations and boxes of school projects that still smelled faintly of glue and chalk. When we pulled it into the light, the cardboard sagged, the lid warping with age. Inside, photographs, folded letters, and a small spiral-bound notebook with a cover once blue, now faded to an almost colorless gray. Handwriting. Not the parts into the file, not the quotes cherry-picked for motive. This was unfiltered, unearned. I slipped on gloves and opened the notebook. The pages crackled softly, the ink marred in places by humidity or tears. It was hard to tell. Her words weren't dramatic. They didn't read like a warning or a prophecy. They were ordinary in the way that makes them matter. Notes about shifts at the diner, small aspirations, sketches in the margins of lilies and train tracks. A girl trying to make sense of being young in a town that felt too small to contain her longing. One line stopped my eye. Some places feel like they're watching you back. The depot especially. Sometimes I think it remembers more about me than I do. My throat tightened. I flipped forward. There were mentions of a him now and then, never named, always implied. Not the boyfriend who left town, this was different. This one was local, quiet. Someone who understood the way silence worked. Someone who listened when she talked about leaving. He said the depot is a good place to think. That nobody goes there. That things can be said in empty places and they'll stay there, like secrets pressed into the walls. The words blurred for a moment. I blinked hard. I turned more pages. A pattern emerged. Dates, brief impressions, fragments of conversations. A sense of something starting and never quite becoming. Then abruptly, the tone shifted. He's been strange lately. Distant. I think I scared him when I said I wanted more than a secret. Maybe that's all I am here. A secret someone will drive away from when they're done remembering me. No name, no description. Only the undertone of a girl realizing she'd pinned her hopes to someone, whose silhouette was clearer than his face. I closed the notebook. Find anything. Anna's voice drifted from the doorway, cautious. I turned slightly. Pieces, I said. She wrote that the depot felt like it was watching her. Anna nodded once, stepping forward. She liked going there, she said. Said it was the only place that didn't ask her to smile. Her gaze dropped to the open box. You can read it, I offered, or I can. No, she shook her head. Not yet. I've spent too long building stories about who she was. I'm not sure I can survive the real version. I understood. Sometimes the image of someone is what keeps you from collapsing. Reality can be, even when it's kinder. The photographs were next. Most were what you'd expect. Holidays, birthdays, blurry roadside snapshots. But a few were different, strange, almost artistic. They centered the depot, its windows dark, its tracks slicing the frame. In some, stood near the entrance, arms crossed, expression caught between defiance and uncertainty. In one photo, she was alone on the platform, the sky